Have you ever been in a situation, professionally or personally, where people just didn't seem to recognize your value? If so, and you want to learn how to make sure you step up that value, today's show is for you. The Awakening You. The answers are within. Welcome to the Awakening You podcast, reminding you that the answers are within. My name is Scott Goyette, and I'm your host. Each week in this podcast, I will be sharing some simple yet very useful tools to help you dive deep and discover how infinitely powerful you really are. The show is based on specific growth models created by the Go Love Now movement that will help you choose love and move through your fears. The love model, LOVE, stands for listening, observing, voicing, and empathizing. The fear model, FEAR, stands for forgiving, eliminating beliefs that no longer serve you and may have never served you, accepting yourself and others where you or they are at in their journey, and rising up and becoming resilient. During each podcast, my amazing guests will share their experience with using these tools and how you might benefit from using them as well. All information shared during this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. Nothing from this podcast should supersede the directions of a doctor or mental health professional. So today's guest is a very good friend of mine. I initially met him through sports, like many of my friends. Today's guest is Arvin Poole. How are you, Arvin?
I'm good. How are you, Scott? Thank you for having me.
Absolute pleasure. I'm glad that we're here today. So you and I have been having some interesting conversations on some pretty deep topics about things that are going on in the world. But then we started talking about the things that we really connect with in the most. You know, a lot of the things about business and entrepreneurship and finding value in yourself. And we've had some good conversations about that. So today I really want to connect with you because you've shared some great stuff with me. I really want to know more about how an individual can find the value in themselves and convey that to others in the workplace or as an entrepreneur, because a lot of people I don't think are getting that.
Yeah. So, you and I have chatted offline about this, and, a lot of people ask, Arvin, what are you? Are you a business owner? Do you work, in corporate America? And I tell people, well, I do both. I don't limit myself. And in any role that any person does in any company that they work for, they're always demonstrating and also exhibiting entrepreneurial skills, whether they know it or not. I mean, we're all salespeople. In order to get a job, what do? You promote yourself. So I think sometimes we shortchange ourselves in that process and always undervalue ourselves as a business owner or an entrepreneur. And so it's also one of those things we don't really talk about, like I have to do one or the other. And so hopefully we can kind of get into some of those cross transferable skills that apply to both. And for someone who's never tapped into entrepreneurship, I just want to kind of share some of the things that I have learned, some goods and some not so goods, and things that I would steer far away from when you're trying to do both. So
I like that. And so, a couple things I want to share. As a business professor, sometimes my students ask me questions about, how do you do these things in the real world? One of the things we talk about specifically are the 4 P's of marketing, and that's product, price, place, and promotion.
Yep.
They always say to me, which is the most important of those 4 to you? And I always come back with price, and let me tell you why. Yeah. Because price is the value you put on something. So if I price something too low from the get-go and then try to raise the price, it's really difficult to make that happen. If I overprice something and then all of a sudden I try to shift markets and drop the price, people say, what's wrong with the product?
Right.
So coming up with that price point, which is really just a currency transfer of value.
Right.
So what do I think the value is that I trust in the value? So once I believe in my product or myself enough, which is one and the same, the product or the person.
Right.
Once I believe in that enough, then I can truly transfer that value and make people want to buy into that. You told me a story earlier, very recently, about how that happened to you, where you had a creative value and it put you in a weird situation. Tell me a little more about that.
Yeah, without getting into too much detail, Scott, because this just actually happened today, and I'll share a little bit about it. when you are in the process of looking for your next opportunity, or you're trying to renegotiate or negotiate on an existing opportunity, whether that be with a client, whether that be with a partnership or your next, job, the first thing you look at is your own value. And back to the 4 Ps, I completely agree with you 100%, is that price is definitely an important one. But not only price, where I feel like I fell short in my career is not the price part, but it was the promotion. It's like we hate talking about ourselves. We hate, putting ourselves on this pedestal to say, hey, I do this, this, and this. And I'm always used to other people telling me, my value. But when you leave it in the hands of other people, you leave yourself sort of wide open for what people may perceive of you versus what the value of yourself. And so that part there that I just went through, I ensured myself that I was not going to leave price on the table by itself without promotion. And so the other two are also important, but in the negotiation of putting a price out there for what I consider was valuable, like something that would equate to my value, I set a range. And the company that I interviewed with, we went through 6 rounds of interviews. It took us over a month to get to a final offer. And in that process, I was still careful as to not overcommit myself. And so they gave me 24 hours, and I said, hey, I need another 24 hours. So in return, I gave them 48 hours. And I accepted the offer verbally. And then on the flip side of that, I went to my current employer and I told them, I said, hey, I accepted this offer, and let's fast forward. My current manager, immediately said, Arvin, I completely understand. I gave them the reasons why I was pursuing an opportunity outside of the company. And it was those 2 things. One was price. I felt I was undervalued. 2 was I really didn't feel like what I had considered promoting to my manager was getting to those who made the decisions around my role. And so I made it very clear that not only did I want to focus on price and value, or price and promotion, I also wanted to focus on placement. Like I want to make sure that my career, that I was positioned to be successful and to grow. So they immediately said, you know what, let me go talk to my boss. And I gave them a number that had been presented to me that I had accepted already. Actually, they went back and they not only met it, they added more to it, much more than what I had ever would even thought to ask for. So going back to value, a lot of it is perception, right?
Yes.
What I thought was valuable, maybe at that point, was less than what they perceived as valuable. Why wasn't that presented to me before I started this process? Because you have to initiate and let people know what your value is and promote it.
And that is so difficult to do. And so one of the reasons I'm having you here today anyway is very specific, that we talk about the love and the fear model. And so many of us don't love ourselves enough, first and foremost, to even conceptualize that we're worth some huge value. And we have fear that gets in the way and is constantly, breaking down our self-esteem and our belief in ourselves. So here we are. You just got an opportunity, almost in a way by luck. You went over there and you had a new opportunity. It bounced back and forth. And like you said, you could have actually sat there and probably gone back and forth and even got more. But I love the fact that you're like, hey, you know what? You're a loyal person. You would have rather stayed with company A, assuming that you got your value.
Right.
Think of this in relationships. Imagine this in a marriage where because really what I'm seeing the breakdown here is it's valuation and communication. And what happens is when you don't love yourself enough and then you start to love yourself more, what ends up happening is you start to say, I will no longer accept these things. A certain amount of money you receive, a certain way people speak to you, a certain way you're received by others. You just have this zero tolerance for things. So here's something that's going to happen to all of us once we embrace the love and the fear models. Once you love yourself more, instantly you're going to start to realize I am worth it. Yeah. I'm a beautiful human being. I'm a wonderful spirit, and I deserve the best.
Right.
Now, even as I said that, some of our listeners are going, how do you think you deserve the best?
Right.
And someone's saying that right now. Here's how I know, because we all do. Because we're all infinite beings. So let's talk about that lesson. And let's address, our listeners right now. what could they do in their life to do this before this happens? How do we love ourselves more to literally say, because we get asked a question right now, are you worth $100, $200 an hour, $300 an hour for it? At some point, you're going to go, dude, that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
That's just way too much.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how do we get them to be proactive, avoid this situation, receive their full value, and promote themselves without feeling egotistical, but being heartfelt?
Absolutely. That's, to me, the fine line. You hit the nail on the head is, there's this balance between being self-aware of your value and also being able to communicate your self-value without being egotistical or full of yourself, right? And so that fine line comes to me with, first of all, I want to be truly authentic and transparent with myself. I want to make sure that I understand why it's the purpose going through this exercise is not for me to realize what my true value is. That's not the true message behind any of this. The true why for me is every step of going through an obstacle in life or something that you feel will be a challenge or in your way, you have to stop and make a decision. You're always going to be faced with a fork in the road where you have to make a decision. And so what this process has taught me, two things. One is it taught me to be true to myself and to make sure that whatever decision I made, that I fully stuck with that decision and not sway. Because when you start to sway and then start doubting yourself, well, guess what? Intrinsically, your value starts to dwindle, because that's how people are going to persuade you as not being, true to your word, or you're not consistent, or you're not being grounded. And so that was the first thing going into this, is that before I start the process of communicating my value, I wanted to have 2 feet in the ground and knowing that I am committed to whatever value I place on myself. And if other perceives me more or less, I'm okay with that, as long as I was confident with the value that I placed on myself. That is my checkpoint. I learned a lot though. And that just because I was offered more than what I felt doesn't make me any less valuable. That's the perception that was communicated. And the beautiful part about that, Scott, is I didn't decide that number. The number was decided based on the set of actions that had occurred. There was no way I could have planned it that way. So that goes back to being true and loving yourself and being authentic and say, whatever comes out of this, I know that my heart was there first, and my brain actually have the intellect and the stimulation to make sound decisions. It has to come from the heart. And I made sure in every step of that process, my heart was there.
Yeah. And I love a few of the words that you said there with authenticity and being true to yourself, because authenticity is everything. And I think a lot of us would get carried away and maybe get in that situation, and ego starts to feed, and you start to say, you know what, maybe I can get more money. Maybe I can get more money, while you were sitting there almost in a state of, I wouldn't say total shock, but like, wow, I'm surprised, happily surprised. Yeah. But I think you nailed it. The reason they most likely said, here's a guy who's true to his word, his authentic self. They know that. They can feel that, because that's who you are. So I would challenge our listeners to start thinking of this. Instead of saying, I think I'm worth more, say, I am worth more, and creating that value. So let's talk about that a little bit, because this is what I would be thinking right now if I'm sitting as a listener. I'm thinking, okay, so this guy went and got another job. They gave him more money. All of a sudden, he's getting this great paycheck. Well, that sounds fine and dandy. So now what I don't want to happen is we get half of our listeners going and say, I demand twice the amount of money because I'm worth it. But there's a gap between your work ethic, your congruency, your authenticity, and your actual value. How do we create that value? What do you think that you might have missed between what you were being paid and now what you're getting paid? So that value, how do you create that? Because that's what people are need to understand, is what made Arvin 2 days ago worth less than Arvin today. How do we fill that gap, and how do we create that value?
Yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, you still got to show up. You still got to do the work. And to me, one of the things that I've always practiced is under promise and over deliver.
Love it.
Under promise and over deliver has always been my philosophy. I learned that back in the military, the 10 years that I served, and talk less and do more. So people judge you on your actions. People judge you on your results, not for what you say. Although I'm in marketing and we promote the things that we say we're going to do, at the end of the day, it's about results. And so when you look at, your current value versus your future value, or your past value versus your current value, it is still what people perceive as being more or less. So how do I ensure that if someone is looking at me and saying, hey, is your work as valuable or more valuable than the next candidate? Well, I will say, take a look at what has been done. And so I'm always a proponent of whatever work that I've done, I can show it without saying it and not having to talk much about it. Yes, I feel like I'm a great communicator in getting my point across, but it's the work speaks always for itself. And even if I'm a horrible communicator at that, the work still speaks for itself. And that's where people look at whether you're more valuable or not as valuable.
No, that's so true. And one of the things I think just like somebody who's in debate and knowing what the other person's going to say, so you're prepared for that argument, I think the same thing comes into play here. So if people were planning on, going to their boss and saying, I'd like a raise, or I think I'm in line for that advancement, or whatever it is, I think first and foremost, I think a very smart thing you should always do is understand the turnover costs for your role. So, look into that and realize if they hire a new person, is this going to cost the company $36,000? Is it going to be $5,000? Is it going to be $100,000? Yeah. I mean, I've been in jobs that it literally would cost them $100,000+ just to get a new person easily. Absolutely. Because of the training and everything they put into putting you in place. Yeah. So
Yeah, Scott, I want to hit on that because, let's talk about some of those other things that are not salary related, right? Yeah. I mean, there's even not only training, but getting yourself acclimated to any company culture. That takes time, and it's a personality. It has to be a personality match. If a person is not matched well with a company's culture, then that's going to be a pretty difficult transition, regardless of how skilled that person is. But let's talk about some other ones outside of that. So if you're in a role where you're in a profit center or a cost center or both, in my role, I am both. So I manage spend or manage dollars spent for a return on that dollar invested. So if I can come in and generate X amount of dollars and also increase the return on that dollar, let's say by 20%, I've increased my value instantly, right? Yep. And then if I can compare that, or not even compare it, if I can align that with the company's goals and know what those goals are for the next year and the next year, and I'm constantly beating those goals, well, your CEO, your CMO, your CTO, and whoever else is in the food chain of making those key decisions, they're going to realize that this person is valuable. There are a lot of people that are doing the work but don't recognize the dollar value of their contribution. And so always challenge the P&L, the profit and loss statements. Always challenge the expense statements. Those boring statements that a lot of employees say, you know what, I just brush over that. Those are the things that I read to make sure that my goals, my personal goals, are aligned with the company's goals.
So that makes a lot of sense for a lot of roles. In being a salesperson myself, when I was in a sales capacity, I could always say, well, okay, this was a 3-year contract over these many months. Plus, this is typically what we're investing, and this is our overhead and whatever. I can come up with some hard numbers saying, this is my value. Right. I know there's nobody out there who already has this training that I do, and I can quantify that quickly, which I did as a business person. I can quantify that. Yeah. What about the person who's, let's say, a manager of a few people, but let's say it's like a customer service team. Let's even go harder. What about somebody who's an admin at the front desk of an office? How do they really quantify that? How does that person come in and say, I need a raise? Let's talk about that. The things that are a little less tangible and a little gray.
So let's talk about the 3 letters, KPIs, right? Key performance indicators for any role that anyone is in. There's got to be some metric that you measure your performance. And so if you don't know what those KPIs are, define them, and make sure each one of those KPIs are directly aligned back to the company's goals. Because if they're not, then you will be replaced or you will become a piece of lint on the wall. And I've seen this happen too many times where people get comfortable in their roles. They get comfortable in their position. And next thing you know, COVID hits. So I'll give you a prime example. March 20th, here we are at a point in our company where our product and service are events. They are face-to-face events where we are administering clinical and health medical related events. Well, when COVID hit, those events began to close. So we immediately get impacted by COVID. So we had to think fast and create some other ways of generating the same revenue. And that was through virtual telehealth and other ways of reaching out to our customers without face-to-face contact. So without having those KPIs in place, without connecting the dots of, let's use the admin, for example. This admin may, to most people, be someone that supports like an executive assistant or an executive. They may, call in the orders for supplies, but they're also probably the ones on the phone reaching out to other customers. Probably they're supporting the support staff and saying, hey, we need to cancel this event. Maybe they're behind the scenes. So that admin, although it may not be in her role or his role, if they are now contributing to helping this team push along, then that is a KPI. And it may not necessarily be one that's in her job description or his job description, but it's one that has created this will to keep rolling and to keep the momentum going while we're going through this survival mode. And that is where a person who is responsible for their own career should always define what KPIs connect directly to the goals, because your manager is not always going to be that person to do that for you.
And see, to me, that just sounds like simple genius. And I think a lot of times we get into a role, we read the job description, it always shifts on us. And instead of redefining it, adding KPI on our own, we get mad. We say, this wasn't part of my job description. I wasn't supposed to do this. And then what you're really saying is you're not a valuable asset to the company, because the company's going to transition. The company's going to change. I love what you're doing there, because let's say, for example, I'm at a doctor's office and I'm the first person who, they check in, they say, I'm like, hi, Scott, it's great to see you, whatever. Just sit down. We'll get you with you in 20 minutes. You want a drink of water? Yeah. We could even just do a KPI right on that, idea of say, how many people do we lose from this doctor's, from health.com or Yelp or whoever's giving reviews? Right. Because that person, somebody's coming in not feeling good, and you can help set the stage for how this event's going to go with this doctor's visit. That's a big deal. So there's got to be some KPI that's incorporated, even though it's not numeric. It is numeric ultimately. It's just not immediately numeric.
I agree with you, Scott. And I want to go back to Go Love Now is, at the end of the day, everything isn't quantitative. They're qualitative part of a KPI are those things. Those are the soft metrics, right? Sure. This is, I'm not measuring my passion, for digital marketing, or someone else on my team is not measuring how long I stay after hours to get a job done. Or if I leave early, maybe I've knocked out all my work, but when I leave, I'm getting ready to go and run so that I can be well rested early tonight to get ready for my 7 o'clock meeting. So those are things we can't really measure because they're now tied to our intrinsic system of generating a highly productive person so that I can excel. And to me, a very good leader and a very good manager understands that it's not just about the quantitative numbers, right? It's not just about meeting your sales numbers or the number of calls per day. Am I taking care of the employees on my team so that they feel like they are valued every day, right? It doesn't mean I'm giving handouts. It just means that I care. This is where the heart comes in. I care about the well-being of all my employees. So I want to make sure someone gets married, someone lose a family member, a new baby in their life, right? So if that manager or that leader in that company it's not showing some level of care around a person's well-being, then you're going to lose that connection and they're going to get demotivated and they're not really going to care whether you are concerned about their KPIs anymore because they're going to go look for a company that cares about that. And so that is one of the things that I always value in a leader is they don't have to always know my personal business, but at least if I share something important, that they at least take that into account.
So there's two things there that you said that I really, really like. I don't know if you know the numbers from being a teacher. I have too many things memorized. 68% of all people who leave a job leave because of a relationship with their supervisor. So there's something, it's enough that they didn't motivate me anymore. They didn't challenge me. I didn't think they cared, but it comes with that direct relationship. So it's not money. People will say, I haven't been paid enough forever, but I really felt connected. So when you don't have that separation, you have the suffering. The other thing that you tapped into, I think is really important too. You use the word intrinsic motivation. So think of this, all right? If you can intrinsically motivate yourself and show that this is happening. So what does that mean? To be intrinsically motivated means I'm somebody who's passionate about a job well done because I really just believe in myself and my brilliance enough that I'm doing this because I'm bringing this to the workplace. I'm bringing my passion. I'm bringing my amazingness. And so if that's why you're there, first of all, that's going to spread like wildfire, and that can be integrated into KPI. Yeah. That's going to be recognized by almost any manager. I know we've had some that don't, but I get that. But here's the deal. That will carry you far. So here's what I would suggest. As part of that KPI, I would remind your manager or the leader that you are very intrinsically motivated, but you've got to be it. Now, as far as extrinsic motivation, are you somebody who likes time off? Are you somebody who likes more pay? Are you somebody who likes to be thanked in public, thanked in private? All those are wonderful things. And I also think you can use this to your advantage. So visualize this. You were talking about creating those KPI. Let them know you're an intrinsically motivated individual and show them where and when this occurs. Show them exactly how you like to be motivated extrinsically, because what you can do is teach them up the ladder how to make you happy to run more efficiently.
Absolutely.
So let's say, for example, that the Monday morning meeting, they always go, and Arvin was the best player of the week again. What if you hate that? You might actually fall under quota or fall under spend or whatever it is so that you don't get that. People actually dodge quota to avoid those things.
Right. Agreed.
So here again, I think what we need to do is we need to be creative. Make sure you're intrinsically motivated. Make sure you create those KPI that aren't necessarily quantitative, but are very qualitative and maybe less tangible. Right. That's building that framework, first of all, to let yourself know you're valuable, and then to be able to communicate that to your superior.
Right. And I'll touch on one more thing too. It's never one way, right? And so sometimes hear this term, manager, and I use that term sort of loosely, but it's not really managing your manager. It is understanding what the expectations are, right? Yeah. And so just because, my manager may have very strong feelings or his approach, his management style may be different than how I like to receive it, that doesn't mean we can't get along, right? And 100%. So I think it's very important that you understand what people's hot spots are and what makes them tick and make them click. The same thing that he would do to help motivate me to succeed, I have to, in exchange, make sure I'm pushing the right buttons so that he's motivated, to make decision that's going to not only help me, but also the company. It's an exchange, and it's a very, I think of the opera, or I think of the waltz, right? A dance is very fluid and very, smooth flowing. It's the same relationship that you have to have, with your team members, your manager, people that report to you, is always understand where that transition is and where that possible breakdown of communication is, and you hit it, you nip it in the bud as soon as it happens, so that you're not letting that, be an issue long term. So I've been practicing that. To me, it's an art, but it starts here in your heart. As long as you feel that urge to always understand people and to communicate to them authentically and through transparency, then everything else kind of falls in place. If you're a smart person, you're going to be smart. But are you going to be a dud about it? Or are you going to be excuse my language, a dickhead about it? Might want to bleep that out. But we all are smart people. But smart and with compassion, people love.
Yeah. And I always call that heart smart because,
heart smart. I like that.
Yeah, we've got levels of intellect. And, for a long time, because we've been raised in a competitive world, we get hyper-focused on competition versus collaboration. Yeah. And I think another C to add in there is sure, competition matters, but I think collaboration is key. And you've been saying all the right things with communication. And so you might not be managing uphill, but you're communicating uphill. And I always look at this situation. Remember when you were a kid and your grandmother, your aunt, or some relative, you went over one time and you were taught to be polite. So they made the worst food you've ever had and you're like, ooh, delicious. And then every time you go over, what do? They make liver and onions again. And you're like, oh my God. And you learn a lesson about being a liar.
Yeah.
So that's the same thing that can happen in the workplace is where they say, is everything okay? And you go, oh yeah. And then you go home and you complain to your counterpart.
You're miserable.
Yeah. And watch this. What if you just said, this really isn't working for me? And let me tell you why. One of the most important things for me is to get home on time so I can have dinner with my wife, so we can have that good communication. I can get to the gym and run, get a good night's sleep, and come back here refreshed. But this extra half hour you keep me to do this is really starting to put some stress on me. Now, two things happen here. One thing, the person says, wow, I'm sorry about that, and fixes it. Two, there's pushback, and I will promise you something, and this is something maybe nobody wants to hear. But we started this interview talking about authenticity. If you're not true to yourself and authentic, the universe is going to keep tapping you until you are. So this might be the challenge. Maybe this isn't the place you're supposed to work. Maybe something's going to come out of this. And this is where you've got to trust in something bigger than you. But I would always put my authenticity and my truth over a potential consequence. Maybe not always. I'm thinking in my head, I'm like, somebody could come back with one. But I would say this, the consistency of you being truthful and authentic is going to come back, make you a happier, better, more congruent human being. So I would challenge everybody to hear what Arvin's saying loud and clear, hear what I'm adding loud and clear, and just do that, because that communication is going to make your life easier. And I guarantee you, once you say that in the professional world, you'll go home and say it to your wife and you'll have better communication. You'll go say it in this place and suddenly you'll go, and why hadn't I done this earlier?
Yeah, so absolutely, man. And we talked a lot about the workplace, right? But this applies to every facet of our lives, our personal lives with our family. It applies to our career. It applies to our relationship with our children. Whatever beliefs you have, it applies, because if you are not centered and you're not grounded and you're not confident of what you consider valuable to you, like you just mentioned, you place lots of value on getting back to your family, having dinner, where someone who doesn't have family may not know what that value is. So
absolutely,
Scott, you need to tell me, oh, well, this is important. And so if I don't see that, then I won't be able to relate what that value is. And so this goes back to the first question you asked. Why do people place certain values? Because of their relationship with the things surrounded by what you place value on. If I am not familiar with what you do, then my value is going to probably be zero, or I'm not saying there's no value, but I'm not going to place the same amount of value. What's going to be valuable for me is going to the basketball hoops, after work, and making sure I score 16 points before I leave. I'm just using that as an example.
No, that sounded good to me, actually.
Yeah.
And get to dinner on time.
That might not be as valuable to you, but for me, it may be, because maybe my goal is to get to that next level. But in any case, I think that's where we have to always remember that wherever we are in our career, wherever we are in our personal life, everyone is going to see a different point of view. They're going to see a different level of value. And it's your job to make sure that you're communicating that where you feel in your heart is what's important. You continue to tell me, Scott, every day I'm going to be home. Well, guess what? In my mind, at 4:30, Scott's out of here. I can't set up a meeting at 4:15 and expect him to stay over. That would be, I'm going against what is truly important to him.
That is so true. So do we have any last thing that we'd love to send the listeners off with? Any final tip or final point?
Yeah, there's so much more we could talk about. I think I'll end it here. I'll just leave with one thing, is that, no matter what obstacles or things that are presented to you in your path of life, is that you will always persevere as long as you are true and transparent and open to yourself. And I know that sounds cliche, but I just went through a huge transformation, not just in my career, but in my personal life. I just bought a brand new home. which I didn't think I would ever be able to buy a home again until my kids were out of school, right? And here I am, divorced papa of 2 girls. Now they have their own room. It's like, where did this come from? During COVID, right? So if you can see it, if you can dream it, then you can realize it. If you can realize it, it will come true, but you got to believe that it can happen. And so I leave this with everyone. Don't give up on anything that you do. Have passion, have purpose, and communicate your value consistently to those who it matters to.
That was perfect. I have nothing else to say except, how do our listeners get in contact with you if they would like to learn more about Arvin Poole?
At Arvin Poole on all social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, at ARVIN POOLE. That's LinkedIn also if you prefer a professional platform.
I love it. Arvin, thank you so much for being on the show. I love you, brother, and you have a fantastic day, and it was great.
Absolutely. Thank you, Scott. Love you too, brother. Thank you for having me.
Take care, man. This episode of The Awakening You is brought to you by the Speaking to the Heart podcast network. If you'd like to experience our interactive show notes for this episode, we invite you to visit us at speakingtotheheart.org.